invent marriages and weddings. You see, what changed was what Jesus did with a marriage. He took something that is ordinary, very ordinary, the right of a man and a woman to come together. And I say that as a right. They had the right. Nobody had this capacity to take away the right of a man and a woman to come together. They come together, and as they always did. But what Jesus did was he said, okay, I'm going to take those who follow me. I'm going to take this right of marriage and I'm going to elevate it to a sacrament. I'm going to turn it into an outward sign of an inward grace. Complicated. In other words, what it's saying is from now onwards, those who want to participate, those who want to walk with me, I'm going to take this ordinary thing and I'm going to make it extraordinary. It's going to become a sign of my love for the church. Does that make sense? So from this point on, this institution of marriage becomes this beautiful sign in three ways. The first one is he's going to ask you, are you here freely and without reservation? Has anyone forced you to come here? Well, if there's no freedom, then there's no sacrament. Why? Because this is the first way we become a sign of God's love. God loves us freely. No one's forcing him to love us. So in a marriage, when a husband and wife give their life to each other, they're giving it freely as Jesus gives his love freely to us. The second thing is that there's a permanence, that God loves us forever. You think if you're unfaithful to God, that God is going to abandon you? No. Love is forever. Love is forever. And so there must be that intention of loving that person forever. Then the third thing, are you open to life? Why? Why would God at a wedding ask you to be open to life? Well, the thing is, it's because in a marriage, you become this sign of God's love and that they were able to create. They share in God's creation. And so God says, I'm going to give you these three things and I'm going to raise them up so that you at the altar are going to commit to become this sacrament, this sign of God's love. See, that's the thing that I have to protect, the sacrament. Bring your temptation to the Lord. Bring your weakness to the Lord. Bring all of your knowledge and the lack of it to the Lord and say, God, I need your help. I'm on the ground. Help me get back up again. Never stop asking for mercy. Never stop asking for grace. You see, God never gets tired of showing forgiveness. It's us who sometimes just get tired of asking for God's forgiveness and mercy. So pray. Prayer isn't everything, but it's the first thing. The second thing that we need is you to know yourself. Know your limit. Get rid of the things in your life that are causing temptation, that are not good for you, bad relationships. Do whatever it takes to seek holiness. This is what God has for you. He wants you to be a saint, but know your limit, know your boundary. If you want radical change in your life, you have to make radical decisions. The third thing is if you're dating, you see, communicate. Talk with the person you're dating. Talk with the person you're in a relationship with. Let them know your boundaries. And there's some struggles sometimes in relationships, but it's going to be a whole lot easier if you communicate, know what you want, and tell the person you're in this relationship with what you want. The fourth thing is accountability. Make sure that you're accountable. Have a spiritual director, a counselor, someone you can speak to, a good friend that you can talk with. So seek accountability. Go to confession. Go to a spiritual director. Have someone in your life who you can speak to. God has called you to holiness, but He's given you a way to get there. First of all, know who you are. Know what God has called you to. Know that God has given you this beautiful gift of sexuality, but also the strength to direct it towards making you a saint. God has called you to greatness. Don't be afraid of any part of yourself, but in this part, give it to God. And make sure you have accountability. Make sure you have good communication. Make sure you have people around you who love you and have the same purpose for your life, for you to be a saint.
Culture that women give themselves sexually to their boyfriends, and people always say, oh, but that's freedom. you're free. It's your choice. But guess what? When you have people being raised from the time they're 14 years old or 12 years old to think that that's normal, it's not liberating. It's not your choice. It's something that you've been conditioned to think is normal, right, and desirable. And there are all kinds of problems that come from these sexual intimacies early on in the relationship between a man and a woman. And our culture just validates how we're expected to believe that abortion is something that women need, when in reality, our culture just prunes away everything that would normally be there to support that relationship between these two young people. Instead, our culture wants to leave her with no support, no emotional support from her boyfriend or significant other, no financial support from the man. Granted, yes, there's an exception to that. If they make it through, they might be able to get some type of financial support. But you see the point. Because abortion allows people to throw away the young, there's no support for people when they get pregnant. And yes, there's maternity leave and things like that that are very helpful from a pro-life standpoint. But just from the standpoint of the many, many pregnancies that are not planned. And that's another issue I always encounter. Does the Catholic Church hate women because it teaches that birth control is not part of God's plan? Well, the first thing to acknowledge is that there are different types of birth control, and even secular experts acknowledge that the Catholic Church is not really against birth control, it's against artificial birth control. The second and more important point, and I think that I'll be careful how I word this, is that the Catholic Church is not trying to impact people's behavior in exactly the same, especially young people. What we're talking about is something that is part of our plan for marriage. So we're not necessarily trying to get into someone and manipulate some 16-year-old kid into doing or abstaining from a specific behavior. But just because of the law of large numbers, birth control has not worked. Artificial birth control doesn't work. It hasn't worked as a solution for women in our society. I mean, if you look at secular estimations from sexologists and experts, what you find is that roughly 1 out of every 100 of these sexual encounters and intimacies are going to result in conceiving a new human life, a new embryo, a new zygote. And I'm not going to get into all the details, but you can see that if our culture loves to have unmarried people hooking up just because they think it's fun, you can see how the law of large numbers will play out in many, many unplanned pregnancies. It's just bound to happen, and that's why an unbelievably tragic number of women have had an abortion. I think that studies indicate, and of course you can't collect data because it's private, but volunteer surveys kind of survey that maybe 10 to 20% of women in America have had an abortion. Think about that for a minute. That's not safe, that's not rare. And the sexual culture that leads to that isn't safe, and it's not rare. I just want to conclude by quoting something from the memoir of the Apostle Matthew, from the reflection on the life of Jesus, and the recording of the life of Jesus from the Matthew's Gospel. And it has Jesus teaching, quote, "What comes out of the mouth proceeds from the heart, and this defiles a man. For out of the heart come evil thoughts, murder, adultery, fornication," literally porneia. Yeah, we get our word pornography from the Greek word porneia. "Theft, false witness, slander. These are what defile a man, but to eat with unwashed hands does not defile a man." Matthew 15, verses 18 through 20.